Good morning, Facebook Livers. This is Jeff Vastola with Vastola On The Law. The background noise that you hear is the radio show getting ready to kick off my show. We're going to hear some weather in just a minute.
A hot and humid day here in South Florida. Very little rainfall around once again.
Hot and humid
Saturday,
in Florida.
Temperatures around 90,
in
91
August or
degrees.
September
More
already.
like 103 to 105. As we head to tomorrow, though,
We'll be
Sunday,
talking about justifiable use of force in Florida today, and also Dan's question from last week, so should be a fun show.
The following
Remember to type in your questions. I'll do my best to answer them.
The views and opinions expressed in this content
Sorry, I just have to sit here like a doofus for the next 20 seconds.
Hey, we know it's early. But what better way to start your day than by getting free legal advice?
What better way to start your day?
This is Vastola On The Law.
Feel free to type in your questions.
Attorney Jeff Vastola.
I'll try to get to them as you type them.
Call in now with your questions. 877-850-8585. That's 877-850-8585.
Call into the show.
Now here's your host, Attorney Jeff Vastola.
Good morning again, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in to the radio or by Facebook Live if you're watching me now. This is 30 minutes of free legal advice. All you have to do is either call into the show, you just heard the number, it's 877-850-8585, or type your question into the screen on Facebook Live, and I will do my best to answer the questions right here, right now, so that you don't have to wait a week like Dan had to do from last week. Hopefully Dan will be tuning into the show this morning. He asked me a question last week about selling his home, putting it into a shell corporation, renting the home back, and I just honestly didn't know what the benefits of doing that would be or for what reason somebody might want to do that. Good morning, Mom. First to chime in. Nice to see you. Hope you're doing well up in Tennessee. And so I did a little bit of research for Dan. I've got some information to share with Dan. I'm not certain it's the answer he was looking for, but that's part of the show. Good morning, Patty. How are you? So my dad asked a question last week, and I think his question was obviously stimulated by what's going on in our world. And I'm sorry, when I bump my desk, it makes the screen bounce around a little bit. I'll try to remember not to touch the desk. Good morning, Terry. How are you? How are things in Colorado? So the question was, in Florida, and let me remind everybody, I'm only licensed in the state of Florida, so my legal advice is only good here in the state of Florida because I don't know what the laws are in other states, at least without specifically looking into them. And I wouldn't be, I guess, legally allowed to give you advice as a lawyer in another state if I'm not licensed there. But anyway, in Florida, we have what's called, the nomenclature is the Stand Your Ground law, and there's another aspect of the same statute that's referred to as the Castle Doctrine. That's when you're in your home. The Stand Your Ground law is typically the portion of the statute that's applied if you are outside of your home. And it typically means that it's a lawsuit. I'm sorry, it's not a lawsuit. It's a statute that was enacted several years ago now that allows people to defend themselves. Good morning, Gail. Nice to see you watching on Facebook Live. So it used to be, before this statute was enacted, that if you defended yourself, you could be in a lot of trouble, depending on the extent of force that was used and everything else. So anyway, Florida Statute 776 was enacted. Again, commonly referred to as the Stand Your Ground law or the Castle Doctrine, depending on what portion of the statute you're using. But it's actually entitled Justifiable Use of Force. That's the formal name of the statute. It can be found at Florida Statute 776. It's a pretty easy read. It's not short, but it's easy to understand, and it's very interesting. And essentially, the statute is broken down into several different sections. One section pertains to defense of property. One section pertains to defense of your home. When you're in your home, literally, that's the Castle Doctrine portion of it. Another portion, which I think is probably the most often utilized outside of the home, is protection of yourself or another person if they're being victimized in some respect. So that's the Stand Your Ground law. It used to be, before the enactment of the statute, that if possible, you had to retreat. Depending, no matter what the circumstances were, you had to try to retreat before you could use force to defend yourself. This statute enacted new law, in essence, saying that you do not have to retreat anymore. You do not have to be backed into a corner before you use force to defend yourself or others, depending on the situation, and you can even use deadly force. Every one of these different sections that I've already highlighted are broken out into two different subsections. One is the use of non-deadly force, and then the other section is the use of deadly force. And so, the reason I want to talk about the statute today is because you really have to have a pretty keen understanding of the law before you go out there, wielding your gun or wielding your knife saying, well, I'm just going to use the statute to defend myself because Jeff told me I could stand my ground. It doesn't work like that. As a matter of fact, a lot of these cases that I look at in the Florida Law Weekly publications that come in are people that have been arrested and prosecuted and are in jail, and they're filing appeals trying to utilize the stand your ground law, saying, look, I was justified in defending myself when I shot that guy, or when I stabbed that guy because he was trying to steal this woman's purse, or whatever the case may be. And the appellate courts time and again say, no, you didn't have a reasonable expectation of this or that, or for whatever reason you can't apply the stand your ground law to your circumstances. So you've got to be very careful. If you're going to be out there, what do they call them? Vigilantes. This is not meant for vigilante justice. This is not meant to protect vigilantes out there. So don't think that you're going to get off scot-free if you're out there and you're going to cloak yourself in this I'm just defending other people kind of mentality. It doesn't work like that. Now that I've given you the teaser on Florida's justifiable use of force law, I want to make sure that I get to Dan's question from last week. And then once I cover that, at least what I think sufficiently, I will go back to Florida Statute 776 and kind of wrap it all up. Last week, Dan called. And by the way, if you'd like to call into the show, please do. The number is 877-850-8585. And if you'd like to type a question into Facebook Live, please do that as well. Sometimes I watch the show afterwards and I catch things that, for one reason or another, I didn't see come up on the screen while I was talking. So if I missed your question when I review the show, I will try to get back to you. But Dan's question was kind of an odd one for me. I don't do estate planning, so this isn't something that I would deal with day in and day out anyway. But his question was whether he could sell his home to a shell corporation and then rent the home back. And I thought somewhere along the way as I was typing my notes that he mentioned that he wanted to do it as a form of real estate investment. So my first step in the process was to call some lawyers that I know that do estate planning work. And frankly, none of them had heard of this process of selling your house to a shell corporation, renting it back. None of them had heard of this as any kind of an estate planning tool. So Dan, if you're listening, I don't know who suggested that you do this, but apparently it's not a very common estate planning function. So if you want to call back or even type into the show or call me privately, if it's something that you now want to discuss more in private, you can certainly do that. And anybody that wants to reach me privately, you can reach me anytime at 833-VASTOLA. That number goes to my cell phone, by the way, 24/7, 833-827-8652. That's 833-VASTOLA. Call me and let me know exactly what benefit or for what purpose you were trying to, achieve in selling your house to a shell corporation. It came up in conversation that this might be an effort to avoid losing your home or having a lien imposed upon your home for civil liability. And if that's the case, then obviously, that's something you might want to talk to me in private about. But understand that and I'm not talking about Dan specifically because I don't know what his situation is and I don't want to insinuate anything, but if you're sitting here listening and you're saying to yourself, well, geez, I know that I was negligent, or I know that I made that mistake, or I know that I've got some kind of civil liability. It doesn't even have to be for an accident. It can be for any kind of like a breach of contract or something. You say, I know that I've got this lawsuit coming down the pike, and I know that the judgment's going to get rendered against me because I was wrong. And I know that the judgment can be imposed as a lien against my home. So maybe this is a good idea. Maybe I should sell my house now and then put it into a shell corporation and rent it back, and that way I can still live in my house. Nobody can put a lien on the home because I've sold it. I no longer own it. You know, it's going to stay in the name of the shell corporation that I own. And I can get the logic, I guess, behind doing that. But understand that if anybody has any intentions of doing something like that to avoid any kind of civil liability, there is something in the law called a fraudulent transfer that can be utilized by a creditor to go back and actually reverse transactions that you've done to attempt to avoid having to pay for responsibilities that may come down the pike, things that you actually know about. So if that's the purpose in doing it, just be forewarned that a fraudulent transfer might actually be able to unwind what you've done. And then when you've done it, when you've sold the home, you no longer are going to have the homestead protections and exemptions. Homestead offers you a lot of benefits in the state of Florida, not just protection from foreclosure of your home if somebody imposes a judgment against your home, but it also gives you all kinds of tax benefits at the end of the year. So you would lose your homestead if you sold it, and also you would lose some tax benefits in the way of mortgage interest that's paid every year. You know, that's a document that I give to my CPA every year, and it's a pretty substantial amount of money and interest that gets, you know, just basically written off your tax obligations. So just be mindful of what you're giving up if you decide to sell your home and put it into a shell corporation and then rent it back. Now, there are companies out there, because I did some research on this, there are companies out there, and actually one of them is a startup, that will buy your home and then rent it back to you so that you don't have to move out. You sell your house, you rent it back from this company. Everything is predetermined based on the terms of your contract, so there's no surprises. You know what your rent payment's going to be. And this company, I was reading about them online, will give you up to 5 years to buy back the home. Now, again, it's at some pre-stated price, so you know what it's going to cost. The problem is that, hey, Dad, nice to see you. I'm going to be talking about your stand your ground law in just a minute. My train went off the tracks. The startup company that will buy your home and rent it back to you. You have up to 5 years to buy it back. But just keep in mind that when this company comes along and buys your home and says, we'll rent it back to you, they only pay up to 70% of the value of the home. And the reason I guess they're successful is because a lot of people are trapped in their home and they can't refinance, and for some reason selling outright is not an option for them. They want to tap into the equity of their home, but they don't want to leave. And this is a viable option for those people, apparently, from what I've read online. So if you're interested in doing something like that, now that's not what Dan was talking about. Dan was talking about selling his home to a shell corporation that he would create. So he would continue to own the home, but he would own it through a shell corporation. And I understand, Dan, that that's a little bit different than, you know, what I was reading online. But if you're interested in that, it's easy to find. Just do your research. Now, Dan mentioned also that he wanted to do this as part of a real estate investment vehicle. There are things out there, the REITs, real estate investment trusts. These are publicly traded companies where you can invest your money, and essentially where they're generating income is through real estate investments. Now, these are all money-making, profitable ventures, at least they try to be. And it's an investment tool. Now, that is a genuine investment tool. And there, from what I read online about REITs, is that there's essentially 5 different kinds. But it's a matter of, if you're going to do it on your own, make sure that you're a wise investor. Do your due diligence, and don't just throw your money at a company that says they're profitable. Obviously, you know, I'm not a financial advisor, but it makes sense to do your due diligence, because you could lose your money if you just throw it into some real estate investment trust that's not, that doesn't have the sophistication or the backing to do it right every time. So, Dan, I would encourage you to call in. The radio show number again is 877-850-8585. Dan called in last week. So if you're listening, Dan, feel free to follow up with more information or advice as to what's going on, why you're wanting to do this. But unfortunately, that's about all I've got for you. I did not come up with a single explanation or example of somebody selling their home into a shell corporation and then renting it back from themselves, and I don't understand the purpose for doing that. So you're going to have to fill me in, Dan. Anyway, having covered Dan's question from last week, now I'm going to go back to a show topic that my father recommended because of, I think, what's going on in our world, regrettably, and it's the Stand Your Ground law in Florida. As I mentioned, if you're just tuning in, Moses, good morning, how are you? Florida Statute 776 is the justifiable use of force statute in Florida, and it's as I mentioned, it's a pretty easy read. It's not a short statute, but it's something that you can read on your own and understand it, and it's broken down into a lot of different subsections. You can basically defend another person or yourself. You can always defend yourself. You can defend another person. You can defend your home. That's considered the castle doctrine portion of the statute. And then when you're outside of your home, including like being in your vehicle and stuff like that, you can certainly protect yourself and other people. Now, each of these statutes, good morning, Courtney, nice to see you again. So each of these statutes is kind of broken down into two subsections where you can use non-deadly force for things. For example, if you're going to use force in defense of another person, you can use non-deadly force against the other person's imminent use of unlawful force. Now, there's a lot of vagary here because I'm sure people would say, well, Jeff, what's unlawful force? Good question. That's for the judge and the criminal jury to figure out. So that's really the message I want to convey here is although Florida has a law that's entitled the justifiable use of force, and a portion of it is called the castle doctrine, which most people think I can do anything I want in my house. I can shoot people in the back. No, don't do that. It's got to be justified. It's got to be the justifiable use of force. Now, the way the statute's written, it seems to be written favorably to somebody that might want to use the force. But as I mentioned earlier in this show, every time I come across a criminal that's sitting in jail that's filed an appeal because he or she wanted to use the justifiable use of force statute to defend himself or herself, most of the time it doesn't work. So just be careful. If you're going to try and defend yourself or another person in a given situation. So in defense of a person, this is 776.012. Basically says you can use non-deadly force against another's imminent use of unlawful force, but you can use deadly force to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to yourself or another person, or to prevent the imminent commission of a forcible felony. Now, again, you might ask the question, okay, well, what's imminent? You can go to Webster's dictionary and find out what does that mean. But ultimately, the judge is going to be the gatekeeper on these. Some of these statutory sections come with what's called a presumption. A presumption, the Castle Doctrine specifically section, which is 776.013, comes with a presumption that if you use force while you're in your home, that you had a good faith belief that these things were happening and so you could use deadly force. But that presumption is a rebuttable presumption that the state attorney can try to get around by showing facts that are inconsistent with your story. And so that's where you get into what we call the statutory interpretation of the wording. And you have to break down the statute word by word by word to find out what does it mean. And ultimately, the judge is the gatekeeper on whether something is going to be rebuttable or not. Essentially, whether or not the statute's applicable to your situation and whether you can use it to defend yourself. So it's got to be imminent commission of a forcible felony. So the Castle Doctrine section is 776.013, and this is when you're in your home. It says a person who is in a dwelling or residence in which the person has a right to be has no duty to retreat and has the right to stand his or her ground and use or threaten to use non-deadly force, again, remember I told you they're broken down into basically two different subsections, non-deadly force and deadly force. If you're in your own home, you have the right to use non-deadly force against the other's imminent use of unlawful force. So you may say to yourself, okay, what does that really mean? Well, I don't know. You know, you'd have to look at other cases that have gone before you, look at the way the courts have construed the language, but that's the way the statute's written. Good morning, Karen. Hope all is well in Louisiana. So Karen's asking me a question. Now, here's the problem, and I mention this typically at the outset of most of my shows. I'm only licensed in the state of Florida. I'm only licensed in Florida. Karen, I love you. I'd love to help you, but you live in Louisiana, so I'm not. I see your question here, and we can certainly talk about it after the fact. But I don't know what the law in Louisiana is. So unfortunately, that's one of the drawbacks of Facebook Live, is that I can't help you out when you don't live here in the state of Florida. Now, talking about Florida's Castle Doctrine, as I mentioned, you can use non-deadly force against the imminent use of unlawful force. And again, the great big question is, well, what does that mean? Section B says that you can use deadly force if you believe that using such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to yourself or another person, or to prevent the imminent commission of a forcible felony. Very, very, very similar to the section above that I just read about defense of a person. What's the difference? The difference is that presumption that applies in the second section, the Castle Doctrine section, which is when you are in your home. When you are in your home, you get that added bonus of a presumption that you felt as though you were in a situation where you had to use your forcible, whatever it is, whatever you decided to use. Good morning, Maura. Nice to see you again. It says this in subsection 2 of the Castle Doctrine, more eloquently than I just stated. A person is presumed to have held a reasonable fear of imminent peril of death or great bodily harm to himself or herself or another when using or threatening to use defensive force that is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm to another if, and then of course, like most statutes do, it breaks it down into a couple subsections. And these are important because these are the presumption that applies when you're in your home as part of the Castle Doctrine. It says the person against whom the defensive force was used or threatened was in the process of unlawfully and forcefully entering, or had unlawfully and forcibly already entered, a dwelling, residence, or occupied vehicle, or if that person had removed or was attempting to remove another against that person's will from the dwelling, the residence, or the occupied vehicle. So understand, the Castle Doctrine doesn't apply just in your home. It can also apply in your vehicle. And again, the difference being that with this particular section, you have this presumption that somebody's up to no good. That's in layperson's terms. That's essentially what it means. Subsection B, it says the person who uses or threatens to use defensive force knew or had reason to believe that an unlawful and forcible entry or unlawful and forcible act was occurring or had occurred. So anyway, there's a lot more to it than that. 776.031 talks about the use or threatened use of force in defense of property. So, well, there's my wife. Good morning, Mandy. I think she's probably in the kitchen right over there. You can defend not just your property, but the property of another person if you're lawfully there or in possession of that property for some reason. So it doesn't have to be just defense of a person. It doesn't have to be defense of your castle, whether that's your home or your vehicle, or defending a person that's in your home or in your vehicle, including yourself. It can also be the defense of somebody else's property. Now, the key here is that you have to be lawfully in possession of the property or on the property lawfully for some reason. And this is where I stated earlier today, this law was never intended to protect vigilantes and vigilante justice. So don't think that if you see a bunch of looters and you go to that store and you stand there with your rifle and you injure or kill somebody and you're going to use this defense to say, well, I was protecting the store from looters, I'm the good guy, I'm not the bad guy, that this statute's going to protect you. It's not. because unless you were the owner of the store, or perhaps the tenant in possession of the store, and even if you were, frankly, I'd be careful using this statute as a defense. I mean, I think certainly you have a right to try to protect your business, but be careful the length to which you will go to protect it. But read this statute on defensive property, and hopefully it'll give you some guidelines. You know, the way the statute's written, it's there are some generalities, there is some vagueness to it, which is why over time the courts construe the law with their written opinions, and then we read how the courts have decided these things. And what I've seen time and again is that I can't say everyone, certainly not everyone, but when people feel like they're going to be able to rely on the stand your ground law to just get off scot-free, it doesn't work. So keep that in mind if you're out there and you're thinking about what you're going to do. Now, if you're in your car and somebody's doing something unlawful and it's, you feel as though you're in imminent peril, then that's what this law is for. It's to say you don't have to be a victim. I guess I'll put it that way. Hey, Donnie, what's up? Nice to see you, my friend. Been a long time. So I am about out of time. I want to use my next minute or two because I feel like Sharina is going to chime in any moment and tell me that I'm about out of time. 1 minute. 1 minute. There we go. Look, I'm here to help you guys. That's really why I do this, and it's kind of like my it's what I enjoy doing. So if you have any questions, if you want some free legal advice, if you just want to talk to me about something, Karen, I saw that you had followed up with something on the Facebook live screen. I will try to get back to that. But if you'd like to call me, 833-VASTOLA goes to my cell phone 24/7. 833-827-8652. If you'd like to find out more about me and my firm and what we do, you can go to vastolalegal.com. And until next week, I want everyone to have a safe and happy Labor Day weekend. Be mindful of others, and remember, we're all God's children. Everyone get along. God bless everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.